Oh my God, I know. Should I come closer?
Come closer, my dear. Come closer. Hi, everybody. Today I am luring in Brenda Janowitz, one of my favorite people. I am Jenna Blum, one of the co-founders of A Mighty Blaze, and I'm so happy to be doing this special interview today with my beloved Brenda. How are you, Brenda? Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. So excited to be with you in particular.
Samesies. We call Brenda my girl crush around my house because it's true. Like, I just adore her. She knows this. I've been like creepily crushing on her for years. For
Likewise.
those, I know it's a reciprocated crush. Does that mean it's still a crush?
Yeah, I feel like it is. Yeah, it's like a little love fest we have going on.
Maybe it's just love. It's just love. Okay, that's what it is. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to The Blaze. We are a team of 35 creative professional volunteers dedicated to linking writers and their readers. We started in the age of COVID, and now we are going well beyond that. We are so dedicated to bringing your favorite authors to you in your living room, where you can ask them all the questions you ever wanted to know answers to without even having to put on pants. And if you like what you see here, please give us a like or a follow on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube. We are ubiquitous. Please consider signing up for our newsletter at www.mightyblaze.com so you never have literary FOMO ever again. No more FOMO. Nobody likes that. And today, as I said, I am so delighted to have Brenda with us. Brenda is here to talk about her new book, The Audrey Hepburn Estate, which I love, because who doesn't love Audrey? I have so many questions about Audrey, about the book. I wore my little black dress, and one of 8,000 little black dresses that I have in honor of Audrey and of you, Brenda, and I also may or may not be drinking a chocolate martini, because why? Why am I allowed to do this at noon?
Well, because Audrey Hepburn was obsessed with chocolate. And that was one of the things I discovered when researching her that I had no idea about. She had this huge connection to food. She loved eating. She loved cooking. She loved being at home, all of which inspired the book. But she really loved chocolate, and she made sure to eat chocolate every day.
And she was super long-lived, and she was also tiny as a sparrow. I think we all know this about her. She was really dainty. How did that work?
Well, you know, one of the other things I learned when I started my research was that she lived under Nazi occupation in Holland during World War II. So for 5 years, she suffered severe malnutrition while she was just sort of like surviving during the war. And that's real. I mean, she always had a slight figure. She was a dancer when she was a little girl, and she wanted to pursue it professionally. But this malnutrition sort of followed her throughout her life. So even after the war, when she started eating healthy foods and all of that, this sort of always stayed with her. And I think a lot of people think that maybe she had an eating disorder or she didn't eat, but she did. She loved food. In one of the books that one of her sons, I can't remember which son it was, they joked that like when she traveled, she would bring like a jar of pasta sauce and spaghetti because she also had to have her pasta with sauce all the time. So she loved to eat, but this malnutrition really just followed her whole life and affected her for her entire life.
Yes, because I was going to say, when I eat chocolate and when I bring my jar of pasta sauce and pasta with me on trips, it doesn't quite have the same effect on my metabolism. But wow. I think that's just like a special Audrey magic thing, and she did have her own magic. I saw Tori said like she also loves a chocolate martini. Tori is an author who wrote most recently about bourbon. So hi, Tori. And to all of you repeat offenders, I know Brenda's drinking vodka right now. She's drinking a tumbler full of vodka. But to those of you who are joining us as habitual watchers of The Blaze, welcome back. Thank you for bringing your party to The Blaze. Go get y'all something to drink. We're just going to have a really good chat today. And the more you drink, the more interesting I am, at least. Brenda is already interesting. So bon appetit, bottoms up. I am so excited to see you. I forgot to read your bio because classy like that. So let me do that for people who have been hiding under a rock and who don't know who you already are. Are you ready for your bio?
I am.
Okay, buckle up at you. Brenda Janowitz is the author of 7 other novels, including The Grace Kelly Dress and The Liz Taylor Ring, which we also talked about last time on The Blaze. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times, Real Simple, The Washington Post, and the New York Post, among others. Brenda is a graduate of Cornell at Hofstra Law and lives in New York with her husband and 2 sons. And you can find her on Instagram. Brenda Janowitz, writer. Brenda has great gram. She gives great everything, gives great books. I want to ask about the Audrey Hepburn Estate, but I also want to ask about the books behind you in your bookshelf, your glass-fronted. Is that a glass-fronted bookshelf?
It's not, no.
Oh, I thought it was. You should just lie.
I can just reach out and grab it.
Amazing. Look at all those beautiful books. Are these all your books? Do you have like a wall of your own books behind you?
I do, because when the Grace Kelly dress came out during COVID and I started doing these Zooms, my editor came to one and she was like, why do you have all of your friends' books behind you? You should have your own books. And I was like, oh, I don't know. And then she just like sent me a box of books. And I think the implicit message was, these should be showing at your next Zoom. So I made like a little thing and then I kind of had fun with it. Do you ever find like sometimes when you're not writing, like little daytime things, you'll just have to like impose your creativity on it and it somehow becomes like a project and it becomes like a little art project for you, right? And it's like you're not writing necessarily, but you're doing something else that's like creative adjacent. So I think that's what happened back here.
I
just like
love that. I'm glad that you said that because it makes me feel a little less freaky. Like this morning I was running around like a cuckoo escaped from the clock, thinking like you have to get your black dress on, you're talking to Brenda, like get your ish straight, like get your questions on, you know, and instead I found myself putting up new lights in my bookshelves in my study. And somehow that actually helped me think about some of the questions I wanted to ask you. And so I think like when our hands are busy doing the creative adjacent projects, they're actually creative. They're actually allowing our brains like room to marinate on some of the creative stuff that we're going to do. So
yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
That is my theory. Anyway, it's why I used to like to bake, but now I like to rearrange bookshelves. And I have to say, one of my favorite things in the whole world is culling my bookshelves to make room for the new books that I get from authors of the plays. But I like to rearrange my bookshelves. There's something so satisfying about it. Why? Why?
I don't know. Do you arrange by color or by author name? How do you arrange?
Oh, I am very neurotic about my shelves, shockingly. So this is my ego shelf. I'll just show everybody my shelves. This is my library. Hi. Thank you. My apartment was built in 1860, and the shelves were built in sometime in the 80s. And the people who owned it before me were like, give it to the writer. She needs the bookshelves. This is all fiction. This is all fiction. So many of my Blaze author friends have their books fronted on my shelves. And if I were to turn my camera, you would see a whole corresponding wall of nonfiction. And then there's my study, which is like all my foreign edition. I should just walk y'all around at some point. But okay, we want to talk to you, Brenda. Stop distracting me with your awesome Brenda-ness. Tell us about the Audrey Hepburn Estate, please.
Absolutely. So yeah, the Audrey Hepburn Estate is the story of a woman who goes back to the home she grew up in once she learns that it is set to be demolished. Going back home again brings 2 men from her past back into her lives, and it really forces her to re-examine what her past was and what she thought it was, and it brings her back to that place. Oh, and I forgot to mention, it's heavily inspired by the Audrey Hepburn film Sabrina. And I mean, all of her films are sort of inspiration also, and of course the incredible life of Audrey Hepburn. And so it's a little romantic, a little mysterious, but it's ultimately a book about the true meaning of home.
I love that. And did you have a house model in mind when you wrote? Because the house features very prominently. I love the house on the cover too. Still, after so many years, I have not figured out like the mirroring camera on StreamYard, our platform, but look at the beautiful house, look at the beautiful dress. So did you have a specific mansion in mind that became this sort of character of the house in the book? Because the house does assume its own character.
It does, yeah. So I didn't have just one. On Long Island, we have all of these Gilded Age mansions, and there are just so many of them. So a few are referenced, like at one point, they go to Oheka Castle, which is a Long Island Gilded Age mansion. So I took a little from each one, because when you live on Long Island, like I do, you get to go to a lot of them because most of them are no longer privately owned. Most of them are public. Like Ohika, for example, is an event space. So Doug, my husband and I have been to charity events there, weddings. I mean, we go to Ohika like a lot. And it's fun. Whenever we spot it on TV, it was the stand-in for Europe on Succession. It was in the Taylor Swift Blank Space video, and it was also a stand-in for Paris on Gossip Girl. We get like so excited. We're like, that's Ohika. Like actually any of them, but Ohika figures a lot in like a lot of pop culture stuff. But you know, I really was inspired by all the Gilded Age mansions. There are just so many of them. I was sort of disappointed early on in my research to discover that the Audrey Hepburn estate, I thought that the estate where they filmed the movie Sabrina would be on Long Island. I actually thought that it was the Glen Cove Mansion, which is still standing, and it's still the address that's mentioned in the movie. But it's not. It wasn't filmed there. And it turns out most of the filming was in LA. And I remember once I discovered that, I sort of like had a panic attack, and I wrote to my editor and I was like, oh my God, there's no Sabrina Mansion. But then, you know, when we were talking about the book, we both grew up on Long Island. We were talking about how there were so many Gatsby estates. Like when you go there are always the original house from Gatsby up for sale. And you're like, how can that possibly be? It was up for sale 3 years ago. So all these people are saying, oh no, this is the Gatsby estate. This is the Gatsby estate. Like 10 different homes supposedly have been the Gatsby estate. So she was like, oh, let's use that. Cause I love the idea of people being like, yeah, this is the Gatsby estate, even though it's totally not. So when the book opens up, a real estate developer is calling this property the Audrey Hepburn estate and saying that this is where they filmed Sabrina, even though he sort of knows that they didn't. So he sort of used it and made it fun in that way.
I love this also. It's kind of like in New Jersey, we have all of the placards like George Washington slept here. Like, did he though? Actually, in Long Island, you get Gatsby. We get George, you get Gatsby. Hardly seems fair, but okay. Can you dive a little deeper for us into the plot of the book with Emma and what her role is at the estate? Because one of the things I found so interesting in this book is this sort of consciousness of class. And I know that is also a Sabrina a thing. And maybe I'm doing a bad interviewer thing, asking a million questions at once. But for those viewers who might not be familiar with the plot of Sabrina, if you could give us like a thumbnail and then maybe apply it to the plot in Audrey.
I love that. That's a great question. That was a lot of really good questions all in one. So Sabrina is an Audrey Hepburn film, which famously starred her, Humphrey Bogart, William Holden, and it's the story of a woman who is, I know, she's the driver's daughter, and they live in a little apartment above the garage in this massive estate, and Humphrey Bogart and William Holden play the two sons, and she's in love with dreamy William Holden, and she has been since she was a kid, and but he sort of doesn't know she exists. So she gets a little older, she gets sent off to Paris to learn to cook, and when she comes home, all, you know, Parisian and grown up, David Larrabee, William Holden, doesn't recognize her. And so he's sort of like flirting with her, and he's like, can I take you to your house? And this is like one of my favorite scenes in the movie. And she's just sort of like, sure. And she gives the address, and he's like, wait a sec. So yada, yada, he sort of starts to have feelings for her also, but he's engaged. So older brother Linus has to step in, Humphrey Bogart, and try to like distract her so that she doesn't break up this engagement. Okay, that was like too much of Sabrina, but at any rate, so you've got the love triangle, you've got the upstairs downstairs dynamic, and that's all of what I wanted to apply to the Audrey Hepburn estate. You know, it was hard when I knew I was doing an Audrey Hepburn book. It was hard to figure out which movie I sort of wanted to play upon. But Sabrina is a favorite. Yeah, it's a rom-com. There's something so dreamy about it. And I know everyone always talks about the Breakfast at Tiffany's dress, but to me, the ultimate black dress is the black dress she wears in Sabrina, which is now called the Sabrina dress, but it's this beautiful little black dress. It has these tiny straps with bows, right? And it's on the cover, and this deep V in the back, and it's just, there's something so dreamy about it. On Instagram this morning, I posted a scene where she's wearing the dress and dancing with Humphrey Bogart, and the whole thing is just like a dream. So I knew I wanted to do Sabrina, and so the first thing I wanted was to explore this upstairs downstairs dynamic. So our Emma is the daughter of the maid, and then I have, instead of two brothers, I have, they're childhood friends, but they grew up like brothers because all three of them grow up on this estate. So they're sort of like brothers. So it's like, it's not a complete retelling of Sabrina. It's really just heavily inspired by it. And I think Sabrina lovers will, appreciate all of that. But, it's too hard, especially when we're talking about these old movies, to do like an exact reinterpretation because, life and times have changed so much. So there's so much that you sort of can't put in there. So it's really an inspiration. It's got the love triangle, but then I sort of infused a little mystery because one of my other favorite Audrey Hepburn films is Charade. And yeah, I just absolutely love that one. I mean, Cary Grant, come on. Like, that's all I have to say, like, Cary Grant.
I drink through the whole interview because I'm like, yeah, William Holden, drink. Cary Grant, drink. Bogart, I don't know. Okay, if you had to choose between William Holden and Humphrey Bogart, let's do a little lightning round.
Obviously, William Holden, come on.
Okay. All right, so Cary Grant and Humphrey Bogart is not going to win in this lightning round, is he? What about William Holden and George Peppard?
Ooh, that's a toughie. Okay. Oof, that's tough. Oh God. All right, I'm gonna have to say William Holden again, but that was a challenge. That one. That was a challenge.
I want George. So again, New Jersey, we get George. You get William, and Gatsby.
During the filming of Breakfast at Tiffany's, Audrey Hepburn famously did not get along with George Peppard, and I think that sort of influenced my decision. Yeah, they did not get along, which is crazy because their chemistry in that film is off the charts. But during the filming of Sabrina, Audrey Hepburn got along with William Holden a little too well, and they had a very passionate affair, even though he was married to a woman named Brenda. And how's this for a wackadoodle detail? Yeah.
A good detail.
And I asked my mother about this because I was horrified when I learned that Audrey Hepburn had an affair. She's like my princess, and I was like, she would never. And my mom was like, oh, that was the style back then. They all had affairs. I was like, what? What do you mean the style? But like, it was not a thing. And apparently William Holden, when he was having an affair with one of these glamorous actresses, would bring her home to dinner with his wife. And Audrey Hepburn did in fact go to dinner at his house. And that poor Brenda must have cooked her something fabulous, I'm sure. But she went. Yeah, so the wife was like aware of these affairs, and the only reason why Audrey Hepburn and William Holden broke up was because she learned that he'd had a vasectomy and she very desperately wanted to have children. And that was like the deal breaker for her.
I'm sorry, that was such an unexpected detail. I told you guys that if you came to this interview, you would learn we were going to spill all the chocolate martini on this interview. This is like the most interesting lunchtime interview anybody has ever seen. So great. But like, who knew? It's so Hemingway of everybody to have affairs. It's kind of, you had to because it was in the zeitgeist. Like, thanks, Mom. Okay.
Totally the style, not a big deal. Like
NBD, kind of like LBD. It's like NBD. My mom actually probably would have said the same thing. She would have been like, oh, who cares? In the same way that when I was like bemoaning in my late 20s, like, how am I ever going to meet somebody I like? She's like, doesn't anybody have dinner parties anymore? And I was like, no. I wish they did, but they don't. So yeah, so William Holden probably brought Audrey home to his wife, Brenda, who made like beef Wellington or like coq au vin, right? And was like, take him away. He's had a vasectomy. He's all yours. Great story. Okay.
If you want a little more gossip, is this too much for lunchtime?
No.
So a little more gossip, just to connect it to the Grace Kelly dress. Grace Kelly also had an affair with William Holden. This man got around.
He so did. If I had known this, I would have gotten all your books in a big stack, and I have them in my Blaze author shelf in my study. And I would have been like, okay, give us some gossip from each book. Okay, so talk to us more about like the Audrey Hepburn research. I was gonna ask, as I ask every author, like, what is the most surprising detail you learned about the heroine? But I think, was that the most surprising detail, that Audrey had an affair with William Holden and then threw him overboard with a big splash because he these boys are shooting blanks. Like, is that the most surprising thing?
That was not the most surprising thing, actually. The most surprising thing was I had no idea that she lived through Nazi occupation in Holland. That I just never heard about. It was something that she didn't talk about a lot. And it's interesting, if you watch the Netflix documentary, the son that appears on it is sort of like, she didn't talk about that, and that's it. But her other son worked with Robert Mattson on his book Dutch Girl to sort of uncover the things that she didn't want to talk about. So one son was sort of like, she didn't talk about it. That's it. And the other son was like, she didn't talk about it. Like, let's explore. Let's figure out what happened. So he went with Robert Mattson, and they actually went to Europe and interviewed people and found people from her life and discovered all these documents. It was fascinating. So once I picked up the first biography and I learned about this period of her life, I started researching it. That brought me to Dutch Girl, and I was like completely riveted. And that was the most shocking thing that I learned. The affairs were also shocking, but just to discover, it's like you think you know so much about these Hollywood icons because they're such a part of sort of like our life. And I've been obsessed with Grace Kelly, Elizabeth Taylor, and Audrey Hepburn for my whole life. So every time I started the research, I was like, I know everything there is to know. Like, I could just start writing, like, easy peasy. And then I start reading up, and usually I do the writing while I'm doing the research, and they sort of inform each other. But this one, I learned so many things. I threw out the first 50 pages. Originally, I knew I wanted to do the movie Sabrina. And so I knew I was playing with this concept of home and a house and the true meaning of home. So originally I had her as a doctor because my husband's a doctor. So I thought I'd cheat a little. I don't have to research it. And I like this idea of her being in the hospital. Sort of the opening scene was her waking up and not knowing where she was. Like, am I home? Am I at work? Where am I? Just playing with this idea. But then once I did more research and I watched Sabrina for the first 500 times, and I remembered that she was a chef. She went to cooking school in the movie. And then I discovered Audrey Hepburn's connection with food. I knew I had to switch it. So I ended up just like cutting that, starting over. And, I think that's why some authors do all of their research first before they start writing. But for me, they're sort of informing each other, and I'm doing it as I go. So that has sort of like worked for the last 3 books, to sort of like do it all at the same time. So it'll be like, I'll write in the morning, and then in the afternoon, I'll watch one of the movies, or I'll watch a documentary. And yeah, and that sort of is the way I'm doing it. But of course, I wouldn't recommend that to another writer because you end up throwing out so much.
I mean, you end up throwing out so much anyway, and it's not a bad lifestyle. Like when I'm working on a book, which I do less frequently than you do, like it's years between books because I'm like trying to figure out what book boyfriend do I want to spend the next 3 years with. I don't want to get stuck with the wrong person for 3 years because that's how long it takes me to write a book. But I will spend the first 6 months doing research, like just sitting and reading and watching everything I can, and then trying to create an outline from that. So I don't fold it together the way you do. But I will say I still throw out, excuse me, a lot because of revisions. Like,
Right.
alas, you don't get it right out of the starting gate.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing people don't know about writing. And I think that's the mistake that like newer writers are making. And I remember when I was writing my first novel, I was sort of like, every sentence is precious, every word, nothing can be deleted. And now I understand that like writing begets writing. So it's like you start, you turn the faucet on, you're going to have more pages, you're going to have more words. So you don't just have to keep those words because they're already on the page. You can throw out 50 pages and you'll get 100 more. But now that the story is where it needs to be, that's what needs to happen. So
it's so true. And I hate that idea. So like I, have been doing this since I was 4, which is more years than I even will admit to on air. But I still like, as sort of a perfectionist who likes to rearrange bookshelves and has like container store brain and likes everything to be perfect, which so much of life is, right? I hate the idea of not being perfect right out of the gate, right? Or of making a mess, or of having to throw out pages. And yet, for my first book, I have a fire trap in my attic that consists of 800, like literally 800 pages of paper, like reams of paper that were drafts and drafts and drafts of that book, and notebooks and notebooks and notebooks. So I think it's right. There's no one right or wrong way to do this. And it's one of the reasons I love talking to other writers whose work I love, because you hear the differences in creative process. And it is true that no matter how you approach it, you're going to be throwing those pages out or repurposing them on your website for your readers or whatever, right? It's just the way it goes. Like, how did it feel to throw out those first 50 pages? Were you like, it's a thing? Or were you like, oh, my darlings, oh?
I'm trying to think. I don't remember exactly how I felt. I think I just like threw them out. I think I was just sort of like, this doesn't work and that's okay. And I think when I throw something out, what I always do, I always keep an extra folder of deleted things, because I'm always like, oh, I'll use them later. But it also like softens the blow, right? It's like not as bad if you have to throw them out. If you're like, no, I'll use them later. So I think I just like popped it into that folder, and then I'm always like, oh, maybe I can fix it. But like, you can't fix it. Like, why would this chef be in a hospital waking up? Like, it doesn't work. And I also realized that that's not where the book began. I think that's another thing. It's important. Sometimes it takes you a while to figure out where the story actually begins. And sometimes you're starting too soon or too late. So that was part of that process. So yeah, I think the main thing is writing is rewriting, and that's really what you learn as you get more seasoned. And now 8 books in, I've sort of like embraced it. And I know I'm always going to have more to say, for better or for worse.
Thank God. We are so happy that you do. We're so happy. Yes, we love it. It's true. So yeah, no matter what your process is, you're still going to end up throwing things out, and you will still eventually get it right, is the takeaway here. And I love the idea of kind of storing the things that you remove from the manuscript to repurpose them. But who's to say you won't have another character who is a doctor? And then you at least know, like, you can stand on that foundational work that you already did.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've been writing these amazing series, but I'm thinking of like them as the object series, about like famous, iconic women who we all love and admire, like Grace Kelly and Liz Taylor and Audrey Hepburn, like women of iconic fascination. First of all, I think this is so brave. Like, how do you get the chutzpah to take a woman who has been on a cultural pedestal and sort of use that in a plot to bring her closer to us? Like, how did you first come up with that idea, and how do you approach it with each book?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, the first thing I want to say is that each of these novels are really a love letter to these Hollywood icons. I sort of grew up on Sundays watching their films with my mom in black and white, and I just sort of fell in love with each and every one of them. So each book is really meant to be a love letter to the Hollywood icon. When I first started with Grace Kelly, though, I didn't actually know I was doing Grace Kelly. When I first started, I was trying to write a book about a wedding dress being passed down through multiple generations. But since, to me, Grace Kelly's wedding gown is the most iconic dress of all time, I sort of had that in mind. And in fact, I have a picture of me wearing my wedding dress, which is also inspired by Grace Kelly's gown.
Oh, so you could so beautiful.
Yeah, there's like a little, like it's I don't have a cummerbund, but there's a little ribbon around the waist that's meant to be the cummerbund. I've really been obsessed with this dress my whole life. So when I'm writing this book about a wedding dress, I'm referencing Grace Kelly's dress because I just love it. And so I'm writing it. And so I named the book Rose Point Lace because that was one of the types of lace used on Grace Kelly's gown. So anyway, so I give my agent the first 50 pages and there's like a description of the dress in it. And she says, this is great. The only thing is we need a new title. And I was like, okay, well, for now, call it the Grace Kelly dress. And she was like, oh, I like that title, but why? And I was like, because of the dress I'm describing. She's like, what do you mean? I'm like, what do you mean? Like, have you never seen Grace Kelly's wedding gown? And she was like, no. I'm like, Google it now. So she Googles it and she's like, oh, your gown is Grace Kelly's gown. She's like, just lean into that. What if it was like a replica? What if they were purposely doing that? And I remember when I was wedding dress shopping, like I was purposely doing that. I was like, Grace Kelly's gown. And they were like, okay. Like it was like code. They understood what I meant. Like I wanted the nipped in waist. Like, they got it. So she was like, no, just lean into this idea. So I did. And in the Grace Kelly dress, she specifically designing a Grace Kelly replica gown. But then I had so much fun with that, pairing the Hollywood icon with the heirloom item, that I wanted to do it again. And so the next thing I wanted to tackle, I was thinking like, what other heirlooms are important in my life? And jewelry kept coming up because I love wearing my grandmother's jewelry and now my mother's jewelry. And that stuff is so important to me. So we decided to do jewelry, and then it wasn't very difficult to think of my Hollywood icon because Elizabeth Taylor is known for her jewelry. And also,
Yes, she is.
yeah, but once I'd done Grace Kelly and Elizabeth Taylor, I knew I had to do Audrey because I sort of just, God, I just love her so much. And I feel like so much of my life is inspired by Audrey, with, like, we were talking about the little black dresses, the style, the glamour, and just sort of like how she approached her life. When I started writing this book, so many people said to me, I'm obsessed with Audrey Hepburn, but it was people of all ages. And I found that so fascinating. And I would always say, why are you obsessed? And people always said it was, the glamour, the way she lived her life. She was so chic, like the things that people know about Audrey. It's not necessarily specific to her life. Like, no one was like, she ate a piece of chocolate every day. Like, it wasn't stuff like that. It was just her overall vibe. I mean, maybe they didn't know about the affair with William Holden. They didn't know about her wild side, but, they just really related to the glamour and the class with which she lived her life. So, but I almost feel like I had to like work up to Audrey Hepburn. So it had to be number 3. But in terms of like how, it's just such an homage to them. It's such a love letter to each of these women. And, with each book, I was in touch with either parts of their families or their foundations. And that was sort of like what I always was saying. So with the Grace Kelly dress, I partnered with Grace Influential, which is like her charity arm. And there are just so many people out there that want to sort of like honor these people's memories and are obsessed with them and sort of like what they stood for. And so, here we are. Now I'm on book 3. And I don't know, it will be very, very hard to top Audrey. I will say that. She's just sort of like the ultimate Hollywood icon,
That's true. And I have an idea. I would love to invite our viewers to put in the chat who they would like to see or who they think Brenda is writing about in the next book. Brenda, I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to answer yes or no, okay? So the next book, is it also about an iconic actor and an heirloom?
I don't know yet.
That is not one of the answers. Okay, but let's pretend that it is. No pressure. We totally want to see like another one of these. Whenever you feel like giving us one, we will be waiting with open arms. But guys, I want to know like who you would think.
I'm sorry.
Next in line.
I forgot. Sorry. My next book is actually a young adult novel.
I forgot about that.
I'm supposed to be writing that book right now. So I recently sold my first young adult novel, and I'm so ridiculously excited about this. And there's no Hollywood icon, no heirlooms, but it's very much like a me book. It's about a woman who, well, a teenager getting in touch with 17-year-old Brenda, a teenager who on a whim decides to take a gap year before she goes to college. And she goes off to Europe with her grandmother's itinerary. And so there's like the grandmother, like there's a lot of hallmarks of sort of what I do, but told in my younger voice, which I played a little with in the Audrey Hepburn Estate, because for the Audrey book, for Grace Kelly, I had 3 different women, 3 different timelines, all with the dress. And then for the Liz Taylor ring, I had 2 timelines, 3 siblings in the present, and then the other timeline was their parents falling in love. And for Audrey, I knew I wanted to do something different, but I couldn't figure out what that should be. So I ultimately landed on 2 timelines with the same people. So in the present timeline, we're seeing them as adults, and in the past, we're seeing them grow up as children. So I got a little in touch with my younger self, sort of writing these scenes, just trying to remember like what it was like being a kid. And a large portion of it is the kids at age 17, where like a lot of stuff happens. And I just loved writing from that perspective. And I'd always wanted to write a young adult novel. So my next book will actually be this young adult novel, not necessarily inspired by Hollywood icons, but a lot of the hallmarks of these past 3 books you'll sort of find in it. but just told in a young voice.
Inspired by young Brenda. What is the title and when may we expect it?
So it's called Mind the Gap, and right now we're expecting it fall 2025.
Oh my gosh, so excited. I'm like bouncing around in my chair already. Okay, good. And what stage are you at in that book? Is it done? Are you in revision? Are you generating?
So I'm generating. So I sold it on proposal. So I have, I don't know how many pages. I have a lot of pages, but a really solid outline, which is kind of fun because, like I said, for these last 3 books, I free wrote a lot of it. I was just sort of like, la, 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 and then this. Like I remember in the Liz tailoring, I like read something about Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton living on a yacht. And I was like, we need a yacht. And then I like completely rewrote a scene. I remember Jillian Cantor was reading like an early version. She's like, why are they on a yacht? And I was like, oh, well, and I tell her this whole story. She's like, that's insane. She's like, also, you should make notes of the things that inspired you because you're going to forget it by the time the book comes out. And that's, that was really the thing that encouraged me to do these Easter eggs. Like a whole section of the back of the book is like, here are all the Easter eggs chapter by chapter. This is what actually I was thinking at the time I wrote the chapter. So I did it for the Liz tailoring. I didn't do it for the Grace Kelly dress, unfortunately. So all that stuff is lost. And then it's funny, like, do you ever have this when you go to a book club and they're like, when you wrote this, were you inspired by X? And you're like, I have no idea. I wrote that like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm doing this morning. So, you know, Jillian's idea to sort of like write everything down, I really enjoyed doing that. I thought I would use it mostly for book clubs, but readers enjoyed having it in the book. So I did it again for Audrey, and it was sort of nice. And this way I can remember. And a reader recently reached out and she was like, I forget exactly what it was. She's like, I found an Easter egg and I wonder if it was intentional. And it was, and I'd forgotten to write it down in the Easter eggs portion. It was so fascinating to me that like, even as I was trying to like do this, as I was writing the book, there was still stuff I sort of like left out. And it was so cool that she was like, wait, this is Audrey. And I was like, it is. Right.
Oh, I love that. That's so great. So your reader helped you find your own egg that you had forgotten about. I mean, I think like I tend to remember what I was inspired by in each book, but usually when I go to book clubs, they say, I love the symbolism of X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, oh, thank you. I'm so glad you caught that. And I'm like, what? You know, I mean, people think I'm much smarter than I actually am. The readers are very, very smart, you know? So, and my Easter eggs are always that I'm really bad with names. So when I'm inventing characters, like a reporter, or like a side character or a pop-up character, I tend to use the names of people in my life. In my writing group, mostly, you know, like, and my whole writing group in my last full-length novel was like all different people throughout the books, and I forgot to change their names. So then when the book came out, I mean, I should have at least in copy edit been like, maybe I should change this. And I'm like, no, never mind. And so people would be like tweeting at me saying, I saw like Whitney Scherer's name in here. She's now a reporter for the New York Star or whatever, you know. I'm like, oh, I did put that in there. That's right. I forgot. But I think something readers don't know maybe is that by the time a book comes out, you're usually 2 years away from the writing of the book. So what is immediate and fresh for the reader, because they just read it that morning, is for you like a light from a distant star. So readers are always smarter than we are.
And so at that time, you're sometimes like 1 or 2 books away. That's the other thing.
Well, you are
into the research for something else, right? Amazing. You're like, oh, I don't want to talk about Elizabeth Taylor anymore. I'm talking about Audrey now. Like it's amazing in that way.
It is. It's a little cross purposes. I think, I mean, I tend to write like crop rotation where I'm like writing a book, then I'm promoting the book, and then I'm ideating a book, which I'm doing now, and then I'm like writing the book. So I don't have the cross pollination of research and promoting that most writers do, but I do start thinking about new books while I'm still on tour. So it's a little weird because I might be like immersed in the research, as you said, and then talking about something I wrote before, or like the first book, which I wrote years ago. And I'm like, oh, what happened in that book yet? Anyway, making myself sound really dumb. Not a good idea. Should stop drinking the martini. So I think we have a couple of audience questions, and I'm wondering if our producer can pop them up for us. Audience question, is there an author that inspires you? That is a great question. We know you're inspired by these iconic women and by your own younger self, which we totally fist bump you for. Who inspires you as an author?
Oh God, I mean, so many people. Well, you obviously, your writing is just so brilliant and beautiful on a sentence level. And I fell in love with one of your fictional characters, which is weird, but totally normal.
So great. So great. Now, Brenda and our friend Andrea Peskin-Katz have a long-running feud going on about my character Peter Rashkin, who's a Holocaust survivor chef in my last book. And they're like, "That's my book boyfriend. That's my book boyfriend." I want to have a Jello wrestling ring at some point between you
I
and
mean,
Andrea.
yeah, I feel like I won. I'm just gonna say that now. Andrea
Okay.
can come at me later.
Okay. I hope she's not watching because she will. Oh, sorry. In addition to me, and then we'll get to Anisha's question. Hi, Anisha, we love you. But in addition to me, which is such a kind answer, who is an author? I guess like when you read this author's books and it makes you think, oh, now I want to write. Like that's the authors who inspire me.
I mean, again, like a million different authors. And I feel like I'm inspired by, when people say, what's your inspiration? I'm inspired by literally everything I see, everything I touch, every experience I have. So, I mean, a lot of times I'm inspired by like the last book that I read. But recently I've been talking to my agent a lot about Gabrielle Zevin because I was obsessed with Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. And after I read that, I did a deep dive and I'm sort of like going through her whole backlist. And she's pretty incredible. And I love all of her writing, and all of her books are so incredibly different. And I'm fascinated by that because, as we've been discussing this whole time, I wrote these 3 books that have like very sort of similar themes. And I'm fascinated by the fact that she's writing like such different things. Like you can't nail her down. Like she's, writing about video game developers, but then she's writing this really like deeply romantic AJ Fikry, and then Young Jane Young was just like completely different. It's like she's just doing all these different things, just how she feels, and that's been inspiring me a lot lately. And she's also a beautiful writer on a sentence level, and also has like bigger, interesting ideas that really make you think. So I'll say that for now. But I mean, really, a million different writers is the answer.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I tend to, especially because I read so much right now for Blaze, if there's an author I'm reading for just my own devilish little purposes, it is because that author inspires me in a very specific way. So I get it. Like I'll just go on reading Jags. Okay, so we had a question from Anissa that our producer popped up. Here she is again. Hi, Anissa. For both authors, when your characters speak to you, do they speak so loudly that they have changed a book? Like, what a good question. Brenda, I hand the mic to you.
Yeah, I love that. And the answer is yes, all the time. Yeah, it's fascinating how sometimes you'll be writing and somehow the character's just sort of like taking you somewhere else. And I think that's sort of the challenge for my young adult book now, writing with an outline. I've never done that before. And so I'm like, oh, how do I give myself the freedom to sort of like make that change when the sort of characters going in a different direction? But certainly for the Audrey Hepburn estate, these characters really surprised me and were constantly changing the direction and making me think different things. And I had these 2 love interests, and it was really important to me that they be like completely distinctive men so that like you sort of like knew who was who. But I also wanted them to both be like completely lovable, like she could end up with either one and be perfectly happy. And so that was sort of a challenge. And those guys were definitely talking to me a lot, and sort of, I was like zigging and zagging. So I think that happens a lot. Like if you're writing something really character driven, and you're creating these characters and adding all these layers on, like, of course it's going to surprise you sort of as you're writing and change the course of the book.
Mm-hmm. I love that the book bachelors are the ones who are speaking to you. I'm noticing a little theme here. Can't help but say, I had the experience, I usually know kind of who the characters are when I start out and then plug them into the plot. So I don't have surprises in that way. But I did have a surprise with Peter, and when I was writing The Lost Family, is this is your boyfriend, some dirt on your boyfriend.
Yes.
Peter is a survivor who loses his first wife and daughters during the war, and comes to the States and starts a restaurant called Masha's, which is kind of like the Russian tea room, and it's like the It restaurant in 1965. And originally, when I was outlining that book, because I do work from an outline, and the secret about outlines is you throw out as many outlines as you create. So it's still a very fluid process, but it helps me feel like I have some sort of blueprint and organizing principle. For the outline for that book, Peter originally his whole section was in 1946. And I sent it to my agent. And she was like, Jenna, for those of you who have not been introduced to my fabulous agent, Stephanie, she is French and she hates it when I do her accent, but this is how she sounds. So she's like, Jenna, I feel like I love Peter so much. Like his past is so heartbreaking, and also we know he become very glamorous in life. But the way you have him in 1946, he is kind of, how should I say, a sad sack. So I think maybe you should show us when he is more successful, and maybe put him in a different era that is a little more sexy. So I was like, fine. So I transposed him into 1965 and gave him this restaurant, and then creating the restaurant and that culture and exploring him as a survivor / restaurateur, and how feeding people also spoke about his time of food deprivation, like Audrey's, was actually a great joy for me. And Masha's, the restaurant, became its own character, its own menu, its own everything. So it was really fun. It was really luscious. I think we have time for one more question. What writing advice would you give to your younger self? What a great question. Oh my gosh, love.
That's amazing. I would remind myself that writing is rewriting. Like I mentioned earlier, I think on my first novel, I just couldn't handle cutting anything. And I was sort of like, no, this is the way the book is. It's perfect. It is. But no, the book is sort of like a living, breathing thing for a while. And you have to give yourself the freedom to sort of change and work with what works, right? And if something's not working, even though it's like your best writing, just get rid of it. It doesn't matter. You'll have your best writing later or in that book. Don't worry. So my main advice would be writing is rewriting, and just sort of like embrace that. And your writing will always be better after it's edited. Once you do like that ruthless edit, it's always going to be better. And I think that's why I save the old drafts, because I'm always like, I could always go back if this is a huge mistake, but it's never a huge mistake. It's always better, always better.
That totally makes sense. And I wonder, as we get slightly older and are now in our late 20s, it's a little bit easier to give ourselves grace for making mistakes and for not being perfect, because that's what life is, right? It's very fluid. So I feel as though that is one of the benefits of aging into our 30s, is that we can say, okay, it's okay if it's not perfect out of the gate. Like, life is all imperfection. So I totally agree with, and I love advice.
I love the way you
go so ahead. I didn't mean
No, that was perfectly stated. Like, I love that. Right. Life is imperfection. That's where the beauty comes from. Yes, I love that.
Yeah. So those of you out there who feel like your life is imperfect, embrace your imperfections today. If it is, like, sometimes life actually is perfect, but it's perfect for like 30 seconds, and then it slides back into imperfection again. And so that's okay. Like, that mostly is the fabric of it. So, like, Brenda, I could talk to you for 14 years, but then I would be preventing you from writing Mind the Gap and whatever your next book is after that. Everybody, I want you to go out and buy at least 15 copies of the Audrey Hepburn Estate, with the iconic dress on the cover and the wonderful Sabrina story within. You will love. So everybody, go on out there, grab this, like, give it to all of your friends. Like, they will be so happy that you did. This is like your #1 summer read. Brenda, we love you so much. Will you please come back with Mind the Gap and be on the show again?
I would love that. Yes, of course.
Okay, good. So get busy writing. Get busy, like, generating more delicious imperfection. Thank you, everybody. Love you all. Happy reading. Have a wonderful, wonderful blazing week.